But I need to go back to the beginning of this story, because what I discovered at the bank was just the tip of the iceberg of a conspiracy that would destroy everything I believed about family, trust, and unconditional love. It all started 3 weeks ago, on a sunny Tuesday morning. It was one of those perfect spring mornings in Boston, when the sun filtered through the linen curtains of my sunroom, creating golden patterns on the Italian marble floor. I was in my usual morning routine. Earl Grey tea served in Wedgwood porcelain, the Wall Street Journal edition carefully folded beside the plate of whole grain toast with organic strawberry jam that my housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, had been preparing every morning for 15 years. At 63, I had a privileged life that was undeniable. My late husband, Charles Morrison, had built a real estate empire that left us comfortable for the rest of our lives, and for the next generations too. Our 4-story Victorian mansion in Beacon Hill was just one of the properties we owned, but it was my sanctuary, the place where Charles and I raised our only daughter, Victoria. I was absorbed in an article about stock market fluctuations when the phone rang. The sound echoed through the silent sunroom, interrupting the morning peace I valued so much. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison," said the familiar voice on the other end. It was Sarah Mitchell, my account manager at First National Bank, where my family had maintained a relationship for over 40 years. Sarah was a competent woman in her 50s, always impeccably dressed and professional. She knew every detail of my financial situation better than I did myself. "Good morning, Sarah," I replied, setting the newspaper aside. "I hope everything is well." "Yes, ma'am. Forgive me for bothering you so early, but I need to confirm some details about the loans you recently requested." My teacup almost slipped from my hands. A strange sensation ran down my spine, like a premonition that something was terribly wrong. "What loans, Sarah? I haven't requested any loans." There was an uncomfortable silence on the other end. I could hear the sound of papers being shuffled and the nervous clicking of a pen. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah finally said, her voice laden with concern, "we have here 3 approved loans in your name over the past 2 months, totaling exactly $2 million. The documentation is all in order, with your authenticated signature." The world seemed to stop. I felt as if I were falling into a bottomless abyss. My mind raced frantically trying to process this impossible information. $2 million? I had never requested any loan, much less such an absurd amount. "Sarah, there must be some terrible mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing panic. "Can you email me all the documentation and prepare everything so I can analyze it personally? I'll be there today." "Of course, Mrs. Morrison. I'm already preparing the files. And ma'am, I'm truly sorry about this situation." Sarah's tone of voice scared me even more. There was something in her inflection that suggested she knew more than she was saying, something that made her genuinely worried, not just professionally but personally. After hanging up the phone, I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process what I had just heard. $2 million in loans I hadn't requested, with my signature. The only logical conclusion was fraud, but who would have access to the information necessary to perpetrate something so elaborate? Who knew intimate enough details about my finances to convince a respectable bank to approve loans of such magnitude? 2 hours later, I was driving my silver Mercedes through the familiar streets of Boston toward the financial district. Normally, I enjoyed this route, passing by Boston Common, through the historic cobblestone streets, past the elegant buildings that told the city's story. Today, however, the familiar landscape seemed threatening, as if every shadow hid sinister secrets. I parked in the bank's private garage, a privilege reserved only for the most important clients, and walked through the corridors I knew so well. First National Bank wasn't just my bank, it was a family institution. Charles had made his first serious investments there in the 70s, when he was just a young entrepreneur with big dreams. Over the decades, We had built a relationship of absolute trust with the institution. Sarah was waiting for me in the VIP room, a room elegantly decorated with mahogany furniture, authentic Persian rugs, and carefully selected artwork. It was where we discussed investments, succession planning, and all important financial matters. Today, however, the familiar atmosphere seemed charged with tension. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah stood when I entered, extending her hand in formal greeting. I noticed she avoided direct eye contact, a worrying sign in someone who had always been so confident and direct. "Sarah," I replied, shaking her hand. "I hope we can clarify this situation quickly." She gestured for me to sit in the leather armchair where I always settled during our meetings. On the polished mahogany table, an impressive collection of documents was spread out: contracts, forms, financial statements. "Here are the 3 contracts," Sarah said, her voice noticeably tense. "This first one, for $800,000, was processed on March 15th. This second one, for $700,000, on April 22nd. And this last one, for $500,000, was approved on May 8th. I picked up the first document with hands that were already beginning to tremble. The paper was genuine, official bank letterhead, with all the authenticity marks I knew well. But when my eyes found the signature line, my blood ran cold. There was my signature. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that it wasn't I who had written it. The style was identical to my usual practices, the particular curve of the E in Elizabeth, the unique flourish in the M of Morrison, even the slight rightward tilt that characterized my handwriting. Whoever had forged this signature had meticulously studied every aspect of my writing. And then, with a shock of recognition that made me feel physically sick, I realized where I had seen this forgery technique before. Victoria. My daughter had perfected the art of imitating my signature when she was a teenager, to skip classes and forge school excuse notes. At the time, I thought it was just typical teenage mischief. I never imagined she would refine this skill to such a criminally sophisticated level. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. "This is not my signature. It's an extraordinarily well-executed forgery, but I can guarantee that it wasn't I who signed these documents." Sarah sighed deeply, as if she had been expecting and dreading exactly that response. "Mrs. Morrison, I feared you would say that. You see, there are additional aspects of this situation that make everything even more complicated." My stomach dropped. How could there be something worse than discovering that someone had forged my signature to obtain $2 million in fraudulent loans? "The person who signed these documents," Sarah continued, clearly uncomfortable, "didn't come to the bank alone. She was accompanied by Mr. Richard Davidson when she came to sign the contracts." Richard Davidson. The name echoed in my mind like a funeral bell. Richard was the bank's general manager, a man I had known and trusted for more than 15 years. He had been instrumental in helping Charles and me structure our investments after my husband's death. He was someone I considered almost family, a trusted advisor in whom I placed absolute faith. "Richard was involved in this?" I asked, feeling as if the ground was literally crumbling beneath my feet. Sarah nodded gravely. "He personally authorized all 3 loans. He told the staff that you had requested maximum discretion due to the sensitive nature of the investments. The documents were processed on an emergency basis, skipping several of our standard security checks." I felt as if I had been punched in the stomach. The betrayal was double. Not only had someone forged my signature, but a man I trusted blindly had been an active accomplice to the crime. "Where is Richard now?" I asked, trying to maintain some control over the spiraling situation. "That's another part of the problem," Sarah said, her hands nervously fidgeting with a gold pen. "He hasn't shown up for work for exactly a week. He doesn't answer phone calls, doesn't respond to emails, doesn't respond to any contact attempts. Our human resources department went to his house yesterday. The landlord said he left abruptly 5 days ago. leaving 2 months' rent unpaid and all his belongings behind. The world began to spin around me. Richard had disappeared, simply evaporated, leaving behind only evidence of his participation in an elaborate fraud scheme. But then Sarah said something that made my universe collapse completely. "Mrs. Morrison, our internal investigation revealed something else. We discovered that your daughter and Mr. Davidson maintained a quite close personal relationship. They had been meeting regularly for at least 18 months, always outside the bank, always under circumstances that could be considered intimate." I felt as if I had been struck by lightning. Victoria and Richard? She was 32 years old. He was 58. I had known him since Victoria was a young college student. I had celebrated birthdays with him, invited him to family dinners after Charles's death. To think that and based on the evidence we've collected, I said, they planned this scheme more meticulously over many months. The loans were structured to appear as legitimate investments in emerging technology startups. The money was immediately transferred to offshore tax haven accounts, which our investigators traced to shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. I stood up abruptly, feeling a desperate need for fresh air. I walked to the large window that offered a panoramic view of Boston's financial district, a view that had always brought me a sense of stability and prosperity. Today, it only reminded me of how vulnerable I really was, despite all my wealth and status. "How long have you known this?" I asked, still looking out the window. The emergency internal audit began last Monday, when Richard missed work for the first time in 15 years. That's when our security team discovered the irregularities in loan processing. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm deeply sorry. We should have detected these anomalies long before it reached this point." I turned slowly to face her. Sarah, always so composed and professional, now had visible tears in her eyes. This situation wasn't just a banking problem for her. It was personal. "You've known Victoria since she was a child," I said, my voice heavy with pain and disbelief. "How could she do this? How could she plan something so elaborate, so cruel?" "Honestly, Mrs. Morrison, I don't know. But I can tell you that she seemed completely confident and in control when she was here. She knew intimate details about all, your investments, your accounts, your spending patterns, even information about transactions you had made years ago. She studied you meticulously. She knew information that only someone extraordinarily close would know." The pain of betrayal was physical, manifesting as a tightness in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. Victoria hadn't just forged my signature. She had studied me like a predator studies its prey, cataloging every detail of my financial life, every behavioral pattern, every vulnerability that could be exploited. "What happens now?" I asked, trying to maintain some semblance of executive control despite the internal emotional chaos. "Technically, legally, you are responsible for the loans until we can definitively prove fraud in court," Sarah explained with obvious reluctance. "We've already contacted federal police, and our corporate lawyers are working diligently on the case. But criminal cases of this magnitude can take many months, possibly years for complete resolution. Months. Years. At 63, I didn't have that time to waste on prolonged legal battles, especially not when my reputation and financial stability were at stake. I left the bank in an almost catatonic state of shock. The outside world seemed unrealistically bright and normal. People hurrying along sidewalks, cars navigating through traffic, everyday life continuing as if my universe hadn't just completely imploded. I drove to my house on autopilot, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal. $2 million disappeared. My own daughter as the architect of the crime. The man I trusted with all my financial security as an active accomplice. When I parked in my property's circular driveway and entered through the side door that led directly to the kitchen, I found Mrs. Henderson preparing lunch as she always did. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Morrison," she said cheerfully. "Your daughter arrived about an hour ago. She said she would wait in the living room." My blood ran cold. Victoria was here, in my house, waiting for me as if nothing had happened. I walked slowly through the familiar corridors of my house, each step echoing on the polished marble. As I approached the main living room, I could hear the soft sound of classical music, Chopin, one of the favorite pieces we used to play during elegant family dinners. When I entered the room, I found Victoria sitting gracefully in my favorite armchair, an authentic 18th century French piece, drinking wine from one of my most precious Baccarat crystal glasses. "Hi, Mom," she said casually, raising the glass in my direction with an almost theatrical gesture. "I hope you don't mind, but I took a bottle of the Bordeaux Chateau Margaux 2010 that you keep for special occasions. I thought today qualified as a special occasion." Her absolute audacity left me temporarily speechless. There was my daughter, beautiful as always with her perfectly arranged platinum blonde hair and wearing a designer dress I had probably bought. For her, casually drinking my $500 bottle of wine after orchestrating the theft of $2 million. Victoria was undeniably beautiful. She had inherited the best physical traits from both me and Charles. Perfect porcelain skin, piercing blue eyes, a natural elegance that made people turn when she entered any room. Today, however, there was something different about her appearance, a coldness in her eyes that I had never noticed before. "How could you do this to me?" was all I could initially articulate. She laughed. Really laughed, a crystalline sound devoid of any genuine remorse. "Do what exactly, Mom? I have no idea what you're talking about." $2 million, Victoria. In fraudulent, loans processed in my name, with the complicity of Richard Davidson. Her expression changed subtly. An almost imperceptible flash of surprise crossed her perfect features, but she quickly recovered her composure and continued the charade. "Mom, you're obviously confused. Maybe you should rest a bit. I know you've been under a lot of stress lately. I just came directly from the bank. I saw the original documents. I saw your perfect forgery of my signature." For a moment, Victoria seemed genuinely surprised by the speed with which her fraud had been discovered. Then, slowly, a cold and calculating smile began to form on her face. It was an expression I had never seen before. Cruel, predatory, completely devoid of the loving daughter I thought I knew. "Well," she said, drinking more wine with deliberate appreciation, "I suppose the game is over sooner than I anticipated." The transformation was absolutely shocking. In a matter of seconds, the Victoria I knew, spoiled and sometimes difficult, yes, but whom I always believed had a fundamentally good heart, disappeared completely. In her place was a cold, manipulative stranger apparently without conscience. "How did you find out so quickly?" she asked with genuine intellectual curiosity, as if she were discussing an interesting puzzle instead of a federal crime. Richard assured me we had at least 4 more weeks before anyone would notice the discrepancies. "Richard disappeared," I replied, watching her reaction carefully. "The bank initiated an emergency internal audit." Victoria sighed dramatically, as if this were just a small inconvenience in her meticulously crafted plans. "Men," she said with palpable disdain. "They never manage to handle real pressure adequately. Always panic at the first sign of complication. Where is the money, Victoria?" "Safe," she replied immediately, her confidence unshakable. "Very, very safe. In jurisdictions where neither you nor the FBI nor any American government agency will ever be able to find it." I sat heavily in the velvet armchair my husband used to occupy during our quiet evenings reading together. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sitting in Charles's place, the man who had built our fortune through honest work and absolute integrity, while facing the daughter who had chosen to destroy everything he had worked for. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking despite my efforts to maintain composure. "Victoria, I would have given you any amount you needed. You're my only daughter, my only remaining family." "Any amount?" She laughed with genuine bitterness, and for the first time I saw real emotion in her features. "Mom," You gave me a generous allowance of $10,000 monthly, and then complained bitterly when I spent an additional $5,000. You made me account for every cent in detail, as if I were an irresponsible child. Because you spent money absolutely irresponsibly. Remember that spontaneous trip to Monaco that cost $40,000? The $3,000 Louboutin shoes you wore exactly once? The Hermès bags that accumulated in your closet? And why should any of that matter? She screamed, finally showing intense emotion. You have more money than you could reasonably spend in 3 lifetimes. Dad left a fortune that would yield millions annually just in conservative interest. You have investments that produce more profit in 1 year than most people earn in an entire decade. But you treated me like a desperate beggar! There was genuine pain in her voice, but that didn't diminish the magnitude of what she had perpetrated. Victoria, there were solid reasons for my decisions. I wanted you to learn the real value of money, to develop financial independence, to become a responsible and self-sufficient woman. Independent? She laughed hysterically, tears beginning to form in the corners of her eyes. Mom, I'm 32 years old, and I've never worked a single day in my life because you never taught me I would need to. You deliberately raised me to be a dependent princess, and then were genuinely surprised when I acted exactly like one. There was painful and undeniable truth in her words, a truth that forced me to confront my own failures as a mother. That doesn't justify theft on a federal scale, Victoria. And it certainly doesn't justify dragging Richard Davidson into your conspiracy. This time the sound was cold and calculating. Richard? Dear Mom, Richard was completely my idea, not the other way around. That pathetic and lonely man had been secretly in love with me for literally years. All it took was a few strategic dinners, a few nights, let's say romantic. And he would do absolutely anything I asked. The clinical coldness with which she described the deliberate manipulation made me feel physically nauseous. You deliberately seduced him? I did exactly what was necessary to achieve my objectives, she replied without a trace of remorse. Richard knew all your intimate banking procedures, all your passwords, all your historical transaction patterns. He had access to the information I needed and authority to process loans without excessive scrutiny. He was extremely useful. And now that he's disappeared in panic? Victoria shrugged with complete indifference. Richard served his purpose perfectly. The money has already been transferred through multiple offshore jurisdictions, the intermediate. Accounts have already been closed and eliminated. He can disappear permanently to wherever he chooses. Honestly, I don't care one bit about his fate. I looked at the woman sitting before me and struggled to recognize her as the child I had raised with so much love and dedication. Where had I failed so catastrophically as a mother? What do you plan to do now? I asked, trying to maintain some control over a conversation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. I'm finally going to live the life I should have lived long ago, she said, finishing the expensive wine and placing the glass delicately on the marble table. Without your suffocating rules, without your arbitrary limitations, without having to pathetically beg for every cent. Victoria, do you completely understand that this constitutes federal crime on multiple dimensions? Bank fraud, document forgery, international money laundering. You could face decades in federal prison, only if they managed to capture me. She smiled with absolute confidence. And Mom, I planned this operation with much more care and sophistication than you can imagine. She stood gracefully and walked to the large window that offered a view of the elaborately landscaped garden I loved so much. For a moment, I watched her profile against the golden afternoon light and could almost see the girl she used to be. You know, she said, her voice softening slightly. I used to play in that garden when I was little. I have vivid memories of running between the rose bushes, building sand castles in the sandbox you installed near the fountain, feeding the goldfish in the artificial lake. Back then, I sincerely thought we were the luckiest and happiest family in the entire world. Her voice carried genuine nostalgia that gave me a spark of hope that maybe there was still a part of my real daughter under this cold mask. You and Dad seemed to have everything perfectly resolved. All the money imaginable, all problems magically solved. A bright future guaranteed for all of us. I felt so safe, so protected, so loved. You were loved, I said softly. You still are loved. She turned to face me, and for a fleeting second I saw a glimpse of the child's vulnerability she had been. But then Dad died unexpectedly, and you changed completely. Overnight, you became controlling, distrustful, obsessively protective, as if suddenly I were a dangerous burden instead of your beloved daughter. Victoria, I was desperately trying to protect you from a world that can be cruel and predatory. Protect? She turned abruptly, all previous softness instantly disappearing. Mom, you systematically suffocated me. Every decision I tried to make had to pass your prior approval. Every man I dated had to be meticulously investigated and approved by you. Every significant purchase had to be justified in exhaustive detail. You turned me into a golden prisoner. There were tears in her eyes now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of accumulated anger, of years of resentment that had fermented into something poisonous. So your solution was to destroy me financially and emotionally, I asked. I decided to free myself by my own means, she corrected firmly. And if that inevitably results in your, let's say, inconvenience, well, you made your choice when you decided to obsessively control me instead of loving me unconditionally. Words hit my heart like poisoned arrows. My own daughter genuinely believed that I didn't love her unconditionally. I always loved you, Victoria. Every difficult decision I made was a sincere attempt to do what was best for your future. What was best for me? She laughed with deep bitterness. Mom, what would have been best for me would have been giving me genuine freedom to make my own mistakes, to learn my own lessons through direct experience. Instead, you kept me in a hermetic glass box, always watching, always judging, always controlling. She walked to where she had left her purse, a Hermes Birkin I had given her for her previous birthday, and picked it up with deliberate movements. Where are you going? I asked, panic beginning to grow in my voice. Very, very far from here. And Mom, don't waste time trying to look for me. You'll never find me. Victoria, please, I beg you. We can resolve this situation. Return the money. Make formal apologies to the bank. We'll hire the best criminal lawyers in the country. We'll find a solution. She stopped at the door and turned one last time. For an infinitesimal moment, I saw something pass across her face. Maybe remorse, maybe sadness, maybe just fatigue. But then the cold mask returned with full force. Mom, I spent the last 2.5 years meticulously planning every aspect of this operation. Every detail, every possible contingency, every escape scenario. There is no viable resolution. There is no possible way back. You are my daughter, I said, my voice breaking completely. I love you more than my own life. For one final moment, something human flickered in her eyes. If you really loved me, she said with devastating calm, you would have let me be free to live my own life long ago. And then she was simply gone. I sat there in my empty living room, surrounded by expensive furniture, precious artwork, and memories that now seemed contaminated, feeling poorer and more desolate than I had ever felt in my entire privileged life. $2 million had evaporated, but this financial loss was nothing compared to the complete destruction of my relationship with my only daughter. The silence of the house was oppressive. Every echo of my footsteps on the polished marble seemed to amplify my loneliness. Mrs. Henderson had gone home for the day, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of the betrayal I had just discovered. In the days that followed, the brutal reality of the situation became even clearer and more desperate. My lawyers confirmed what Sarah had explained. Legally, I was responsible for the fraudulent loans until we could definitively establish fraud in federal court. The process would be long, expensive, and publicly humiliating. The FBI opened a formal investigation, but as Sarah had accurately predicted, this would take many months, possibly years. 2 federal agents came to my house, competent but cold professionals who made me feel as if I myself were a suspect rather than a victim. "Mrs. Morrison," said Agent Sullivan, a thin man with penetrating eyes, "we need to fully understand the family dynamics that could have led to this crime." The questions were invasive and painful. How much money did I give Victoria monthly? Had she expressed resentment about financial limitations? Was I aware of her relationship with Richard Davidson? Were there warning signs I ignored? Each question forced me to confront my own failures as a mother, my questionable decisions, my possible contribution to my daughter's transformation into a sophisticated criminal. Richard Davidson remained completely disappeared. His house had been not just abandoned, but meticulously cleaned. No fingerprints, no personal documents, no trace of his previous existence. It was as if he had never existed, except for the bank records that proved his active participation in the fraud. Investigations revealed impressively meticulous preparation. Richard had gradually altered security protocols over 18 months, creating loopholes that allowed accelerated processing of fraudulent loans. Victoria had studied not just my signature, but also my investment patterns, financial preferences, even linguistic expressions I used in banking correspondence. "She studied you like an academic project," explained the private detective I hired. "We have evidence that she photographed private documents, recorded your phone conversations with the bank, even collected samples of your handwriting over months." The depth of the betrayal was overwhelming. My daughter hadn't simply decided to rob me impulsively. She had orchestrated a long-term operation, studying my vulnerabilities with the dedication of a professional predator. A week after the devastating confrontation, I received a letter. The envelope had no return address, postmarked from Miami 2 days earlier. "Mom," the letter said in Victoria's familiar handwriting, "I hope that someday you can understand that I didn't commit these acts out of pure malice. I did it because it was literally the only way I could visualize having a real life. A life truly my own. The money will provide me the freedom you never voluntarily granted. Maybe in a few years when the wounds aren't so open, we can communicate again. Maybe you can find forgiveness in your heart. Maybe I can too. Victoria." I folded the letter carefully and stored it in the drawer where I used to keep important The Miami letter generated an intensive federal investigation in Florida, but produced no results. Security cameras at post offices showed a woman wearing sunglasses and a hat, unrecognizable. The trail ended there. Over the following weeks, there were more false leads. A sighting in Las Vegas that resulted in a completely different woman. A suspicious transaction in New York that led to another dead end. Victoria had simply evaporated like smoke. My daily routine became a mechanical succession of meetings with lawyers, investigators, bank auditors. Each day brought new revelations about the extent of the fraud, but no useful information about my daughter's whereabouts or the disappeared money. "Mrs. Morrison," explained my lead attorney, James Whitfield, "the money was moved through at least 12 different jurisdictions within hours of the loans being approved. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg. Each transfer was structured to stay below limits that require automatic reporting. The sophistication was impressive and terrifying. Victoria and Richard had clearly consulted international money laundering specialists, structuring transfers with professional precision. 2 months after Victoria's disappearance, my private investigator made a discovery that completely changed my understanding of the entire situation. "Mrs. Morrison," he said during our weekly meeting, "we've discovered something significant about the relationship between your daughter and Richard Davidson." Marcus Chen was a former federal agent I had hired on my lawyer's recommendation. Competent, discreet, and relentlessly meticulous. "They weren't just having a romantic affair," he continued. Based on records we were able to obtain, they had been planning this fraud for at least 3 years, not 18 months as we originally thought. 3 years? The revelation hit me like a punch to the stomach. We found evidence that Victoria opened offshore bank accounts in 2019, long before the first fraudulent loan. She had been preparing the financial infrastructure necessary for this operation for years. The implication was shocking. Victoria had been planning to betray me since long before my husband's death, since when I thought our family was united and happy. "There's more," Marcus continued reluctantly. "Richard Davidson wasn't exactly who we thought he was." "What do you mean?" "His real name is Richard Donnelly. He legally changed his name 15 years ago, after being charged with bank fraud in Chicago. The charges were dropped due to legal technicalities, but the world spun around me. The man I had trusted with all my most important finances had been a known criminal. How did the bank not discover this during background checks? The legal name change created a barrier that prevented standard checks from discovering previous criminal records. And he had worked legitimately for 15 years, building an impeccable reputation. Are you saying Victoria knew this? Based on evidence we collected, she not only knew, she specifically sought him out because of his expertise in bank fraud. They met at a seminar about offshore investments 4 years ago. It wasn't coincidence. The revelation made me feel physically sick. Victoria had deliberately sought out and seduced an experienced criminal to rob me. It wasn't a romantic case that evolved into crime. It was a criminal conspiracy from the first moment. In the following weeks, Marcus Chen unearthed more devastating details about my daughter's true nature. Each discovery painted a portrait of a manipulative sociopath I had never recognized. "Mrs. Morrison, we need to discuss Victoria's complete history," Marcus said during our most difficult meeting. "There are behavioral patterns dating back long before this current fraud." He spread a series of documents on the table. School records, counselor reports, even medical records that Victoria had skillfully hidden from me over the years. When Victoria was in college, there were at least 3 theft incidents that were quietly covered up. Money disappeared from roommates' wallets. Valuable jewelry went missing from close friends. In each case, families chose not to file formal complaints. "That's impossible," I protested. "I would have known." Victoria was extraordinarily skilled at keeping secrets, and the incidents were always structured so that she seemed the least likely person to be suspected. He showed reports from a school psychologist Victoria had briefly consulted during high school. Dr. Peterson noted concerning tendencies: lack of genuine empathy, ease in lying, superficial charm used to manipulate others. He recommended deeper psychological evaluation, but Victoria convinced you they were just typical teenage problems. I vaguely remembered that situation. Victoria had cried, had pleaded, had convinced me that the psychologist was exaggerating. I had believed her completely. There's more evidence of manipulative behavior over the years. Relationships that ended abruptly after Victoria obtained what she wanted. Expensive gifts, trips, access to valuable social connections. A consistent pattern of using people and then discarding them. Each revelation forced me to re-examine memories I had completely misinterpreted. Victoria hadn't been a troubled daughter who needed guidance. She had been a sophisticated predator who had been manipulating me for decades. Today, 6 months after the initial discovery of the fraud, I'm still fighting multiple and complex legal battles. The banks want their $2 million, with compound interest and penalties. My lawyers are cautiously optimistic about our ability to prove fraud, but the legal process is extraordinarily slow and more expensive each day. Financially, I can absorb the loss. My total assets are still considerable, and $2 million, while significant, won't leave me in poverty. But the battle isn't really about money. It's about the complete destruction of trust. It's about the terrible realization that the person you loved most in the entire world was capable of studying you meticulously to destroy you with maximum efficiency. It's about confronting the possibility that everything you believed about motherhood, about unconditional love, about family, was fundamentally wrong. In the silent nights in this large and echoing house, I obsessively wonder where I made such catastrophic mistakes as a mother. Was I excessively controlling? Was I insufficiently loving? Did I create a sociopath through my own failures? Or did I simply fail to recognize obvious signs of personality disorder? Other times, especially during the lonely early hours when sleep completely escapes me, I simply feel a devastating longing for my daughter. Not the Victoria who orchestrated this elaborate betrayal, but the girl who used to run through this house's gardens, who would get hurt and run to my arms seeking comfort, who called me Mom with so much genuine love in her voice. That Victoria, the innocent child I thought I had raised, is dead to me now. In her place exists a stranger who stole not just my financial resources, but also my heart, my trust in human nature, my faith in unbreakable family bonds. Dr. Patricia Williamson, the therapist I began consulting after all this happened, helped me recognize patterns I had ignored or misinterpreted for years. "Elizabeth," she said during a particularly difficult session, "sociopaths are masters at presenting exactly the personality each person needs to see. Victoria studied you not just to commit financial fraud, but probably throughout her entire life." "But there were genuine moments," I protested. "Moments when she seemed genuinely loving, vulnerable." Sociopaths can simulate emotion with impressive precision when it's useful for their objectives. What you interpreted as genuine vulnerability was probably calculated manipulation. Dr. Williamson showed me literature about antisocial personality disorders, especially in young women from privileged families. The patterns were terrifyingly familiar. They often choose a primary target, usually a close relative with significant resources, and build entire relationships based on long-term exploitation, she explained. I began re-examining decades of memories with this new perspective. The time Victoria saved the family dog from drowning, but we later discovered she herself had opened the gate that allowed the animal to escape. The frequency with which accidents happened that resulted in her receiving extra attention and consoling gifts. Her supernatural ability to know exactly what to say to calm me when I questioned her financial decisions. Her skill at making other people, teachers, counselors, even therapists, believe that I was excessively controlling. She orchestrated situations to make you appear as the villain, Dr. Williamson observed. It's a classic tactic, making the victim question their own sanity and judgment. 8 months after Victoria's disappearance, I hired an international investigator specializing in offshore asset recovery. Elena Rodriguez had worked for the FBI for 15 years before establishing her own consultancy. "Mrs. Morrison," she said during our first meeting, "based on the transfer patterns we've analyzed, your daughter didn't act alone. There was professional consultation
Besides
from money
Richard
laundering
Davidson?
specialists. Davidson was just one piece. There were at least 2 more people involved in structuring the offshore transfers. Professional consultants who charged substantial percentages for their services. Elena spread maps and complex diagrams showing the flow of stolen money through multiple jurisdictions. The money was divided into at least 40 different accounts, spread across 15 countries. Each transfer was timed to occur during hours when specific regulations created supervision gaps. The sophistication was impressive and terrifying. Victoria had contracted an international criminal organization to execute the theft with maximum efficiency. We've managed to trace approximately 70% of the funds to final accounts, Elena continued, but recovery will be extraordinarily difficult. Most is in jurisdictions that don't cooperate with American repatriation requests. And Victoria? There's evidence she's living in southern France, possibly under a false identity. But confirming, this will take additional months of investigation. Exactly 1 year after the initial discovery of the fraud, I received a second letter from Victoria. This time, postmarked from Geneva. "Mom," the letter began, "I hope you've had enough time to process everything that happened and perhaps begin to understand my perspective. I'm not the villain of this story. I'm simply a daughter who took control of her own life by the only means available. You raised me to be dependent, but then resented my dependence. You taught me that money solves all problems, but then were surprised when I used money to solve the problem you created. I'm living well now, finally free, finally able to make my own choices without your constant supervision. The money has provided me opportunities you never would have voluntarily allowed. Feel no remorse for what I did. I only feel relief at having finally escaped the golden prison you built around me. Maybe, in a few years, we can have an honest conversation about our relationship. Maybe you can recognize your own contribution to this situation. Until then, I'm better off away from you. Don't try to find me. You won't. Victoria. This letter was different from the first, colder, more calculating, completely devoid of any suggestion of remorse or residual love. I showed the letter to Dr. Williamson during our next session. This letter confirms the diagnosis we suspected, she said after reading carefully. Victoria demonstrates classic malignant narcissism, inability to accept responsibility, projection of blame onto the victim, elaborate justification for criminal behavior. Is there any possibility of change? Of redemption? Dr. Williamson sighed deeply. Elizabeth, antisocial personality disorders are extraordinarily resistant to treatment. Victoria would have to recognize she has a problem and genuinely desire change. Based on this letter, she completely believes her actions were justified. Today, 18 months after discovering my daughter's betrayal, I'm finally beginning to accept certain painful but inescapable realities. Victoria isn't coming back. Not as my daughter. Not as a person capable of genuine love. Not as someone who recognizes she caused catastrophic damage. The money will probably never be recovered. Elena Rodriguez continues working on the case, but chances of significant repatriation diminish with each passing month. The legal process is finally approaching resolution. My lawyers managed to establish fraud sufficiently to exempt me from responsibility for most of the loans, but the battles cost almost as much as the theft itself. Richard Davidson remains disappeared. There are unconfirmed rumors of sightings in the Caribbean, but nothing substantial. He became a ghost, a figure who existed only to facilitate my family's destruction. More importantly, I'm slowly learning to live with the reality that the person I loved most in the world was fundamentally different from who I thought she was. Dr. Williamson helped me understand that Victoria probably was never capable of genuine love the way normal people experience it. Her moments of apparent affection were carefully calibrated performances to maintain my usefulness to her. You didn't fail as a mother, Dr. Williamson assures me repeatedly. You were a victim of sophisticated manipulation by someone with severe personality disorder. Even trained professionals can be deceived by skillful sociopaths. If there's any lesson I learned from this devastating experience, it's that privilege and love aren't defenses against betrayal. Wealth doesn't build walls high enough to keep predators away when they live within the family itself. I also learned that warning signs existed for decades. But parental love can be blind in dangerous ways. I interpreted manipulation as strong personality, interpreted lack of empathy as independence, interpreted calculated charm as natural charisma. Victoria was a consummate actress who spent 3 decades playing the role of a loving daughter while simultaneously planning my financial and emotional destruction. The bitterest irony is that she was partially right about me. I was controlling. I was excessively protective. My attempts to teach financial responsibility might have seemed petty to someone who knew she would eventually inherit millions. But even recognizing my failures as a mother, I can't accept that this justified what she did. Parental control, even excessive, doesn't justify stealing $2 million. Overprotection doesn't justify elaborate betrayal planned for years. 15 months into the investigation, Elena Rodriguez made a breakthrough that revealed the true scope of Victoria's operation. Mrs. Morrison, we've identified the criminal network your daughter used, Elena said, spreading intelligence reports across my dining table. It's a sophisticated international organization specializing in what they call family wealth extraction. The documents revealed a chilling business model. The organization specifically targeted wealthy families, identifying vulnerable relationships between parents and adult children. They provided training, resources, and infrastructure for elaborate long-term frauds. Victoria wasn't their first client, and she won't be their last. We've identified at least 12 similar cases across North America and Europe in the past 5 years. The revelation was both horrifying and oddly comforting. Victoria hadn't simply been a troubled daughter who went astray. She had been recruited and trained by professional criminals. The organization operates like a consulting firm. They provide psychological profiling, technical expertise, legal structure, and money laundering services. Clients pay approximately 30% of stolen funds as fees. This meant Victoria had only kept around 1.4 million of the 2 million she stole. The rest had gone to her criminal mentors. We've also discovered that Richard Davidson wasn't randomly selected. The organization specifically recruited him 2 years before the fraud began, targeting him because of his access and vulnerabilities. Richard, too, had been a victim of manipulation, seduced and exploited by professionals who understood exactly how to leverage his loneliness and financial insecurities. Through Elena's international contacts, we finally located Victoria. She was living in a luxury villa outside Nice, France, under the identity Sarah Thompson, complete with forged British passport and fabricated background. "She's living well," Elena reported, showing me surveillance photographs. Designer clothes, expensive car, frequent travel. She's also begun cultivating relationships with other wealthy individuals in the area. The photographs showed a woman I barely recognized. Victoria had changed her appearance significantly. Shorter, darker hair, different style of dress. Even her posture seemed different. But the calculating eyes were unmistakably hers. We believe she's already identifying her next targets. There's a wealthy widower she's been seen with regularly, and an elderly woman with no close family who's become quite fond of her. The pattern was repeating. Victoria was using the skills and resources gained from destroying me to destroy others. Can she be arrested? I asked. Theoretically, yes. France has extradition treaties with the United States, but the process would be lengthy, expensive, and uncertain. And even if successful, recovering the money would be nearly impossible. I stared at the photographs of my daughter, or the stranger she had become, living in luxury paid for by my trust and love. Against Elena's advice, I decided to try preventing Victoria from destroying another family. Through private investigators, I identified the wealthy widower she was targeting, Jean-Pierre Dubois, a 72-year-old retired pharmaceutical executive whose wife had died 2 years earlier. I wrote him a letter, carefully crafted to be believable without seeming insane. Dear Mr. Dubois, I am writing to warn you about a woman you may know as Sarah Thompson. Her real name is Victoria Morrison, and she is my daughter. She recently stole $2 million from me through an elaborate fraud scheme and is now living in France under a false identity. I have reason to believe she may be targeting you as her next victim. Please be extremely cautious about any financial arrangements or legal documents she might suggest. I am not seeking revenge. I am trying to prevent another family from experiencing the devastation mine has endured. If you need verification of these claims, please contact. I included contact information for Elena Rodriguez and my attorneys, along with copies of relevant court documents. 3 weeks later, I received a response. Dear Mrs. Morrison, thank you for your warning. I had indeed grown quite fond of Sarah, and she had begun discussing various investment opportunities. Your letter prompted me to conduct my own investigation, which confirmed your claims. I have ended all contact with your daughter and alerted local authorities. I cannot imagine the pain this situation has caused you. But please know that your courage in reaching out has protected my family's security. With gratitude and sympathy, Jean-Pierre Dubois. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. I couldn't undo the damage Victoria had done to my life, but I could prevent her from destroying others. 2 years after Victoria's disappearance, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I traveled to France to confront her, one final time. Elena strongly advised against it. Mrs. Morrison, Victoria is dangerous. She's surrounded herself with criminal associates, and she has nothing to lose now. But I needed closure. I needed to look into my daughter's eyes one last time and try to understand how someone I had loved so completely could have become such a stranger. I arrived in Nice on a beautiful spring morning, the Mediterranean sparkling under perfect blue skies. It should have been peaceful, but I felt only dread. Elena had arranged for local security and surveillance. Victoria's routine was predictable. Morning coffee at a specific cafe, afternoon shopping on the Promenade des Anglais, evening drinks at expensive hotel bars where she continued hunting for wealthy targets. I waited at her regular cafe, my heart pounding as I rehearsed what I would say. When she arrived, walking confidently in designer clothes I had probably paid for, the shock of seeing her was overwhelming. She was even more beautiful than before, if that was possible. The stress of our confrontation had apparently agreed with her. She looked younger, more vibrant, completely at peace with herself. When she saw me, her face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, calculation, then something like amusement. "Well, well," she said in perfect French-accented English, sitting across from me as if this were a planned social meeting. "Mother dear, I should have expected you'd eventually track me down." "Victoria," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "we need to talk." "Do we?" She smiled, ordering coffee in fluent French. "I think we said everything we needed to say in Boston." The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This wasn't the emotional young woman who had confronted me in my living room. This was someone who had evolved into something even colder, more calculating. "Why?" I asked simply. "Help me understand why you felt you needed to destroy me to be happy." Victoria studied me for a long moment, as if deciding whether I was worth the effort of explanation. "You really don't understand, do you?" She finally said, "You never understood me at all." "Then explain it to me." She leaned back in her chair, sipping her coffee with elegant precision. "Mother, you raised me to be an object. A beautiful, accomplished object that reflected well on you and Daddy. Every lesson, every rule, every opportunity you provided was designed to shape me into your vision of what I should be." I opened my mouth to protest, but she continued, "You never once asked me what I wanted, what I dreamed about, what would make me happy. You just assumed that if you provided enough money and enough control, I would become the perfect daughter you envisioned. I was trying to prepare you for life." "No," she interrupted sharply. "You were trying to create a doll. A living doll that would validate your success as a mother and your status as a wealthy woman." The words stung because they contained uncomfortable truth. When I finally realized what you had done to me, how thoroughly you had prevented me from becoming a real person, I had two choices. I could spend the rest of my life as your pet, or I could take what I needed to become free. So you chose theft. You chose betrayal. I chose survival, she corrected. And I chose it brilliantly. The organization that helped me taught me something you never did: how to be truly independent, how to think strategically, how to take what I need instead of begging for it. The casual reference to her criminal mentors as teachers was chilling. That conversation in Nice was the last time I spoke to my daughter. She made it clear that Victoria Morrison was dead, and Sarah Thompson had no interest in maintaining any connection to her previous life. I returned to Boston knowing that chapter of my life was permanently closed. There would be no reconciliation, no redemption, no fairy tale ending where love conquered all. But I also returned with a different kind of strength. I had looked evil in the face, evil wearing my daughter's beautiful features, and I had survived. I had loved someone incapable of love, trusted someone incapable of honor, and I had endured the consequences. Today, 3 years after that phone call from Sarah Mitchell changed everything. I live a smaller but more authentic life. I sold the Beacon Hill mansion and most of my possessions. I kept enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. I established a foundation that helps victims of family financial fraud, a surprisingly common crime that often goes unreported due to shame and disbelief. Through this work, I've met dozens of people whose stories echo mine in heartbreaking ways. Mrs. Henderson still works for me, though in my much smaller home in Martha's Vineyard. At 75, she could have retired years ago, but she says she stays because someone needs to make sure you don't disappear into your books and never come out. I continue therapy with Dr. Williamson, though now our sessions focus more on building new relationships than processing old trauma. I'm learning to trust my judgment again, to distinguish between normal human complexity and manipulative pathology. Elena Rodriguez has become something close to a friend. Her investigation into Victoria's criminal network led to several arrests and convictions, though Victoria herself remains beyond reach in France. Sometimes I receive updates about her activities. She's been married twice, briefly and profitably, to men who discovered too late that their new wife was more interested in their bank accounts than their hearts. She's changed identities at least once more, and may have relocated to Switzerland or Monaco. The most difficult aspect of this entire experience wasn't the financial loss, or even the betrayal. It was accepting that I had spent 32 years loving an illusion, the daughter I thought I knew had never existed. The person I called Victoria had been performing a role since childhood, studying me not with affection, but with the cold calculation of a predator. Yet in some strange way, this realization was also liberating. The guilt I carried about my failures, as a mother, began to lift as I understood that no amount of love, patience, or wisdom could have changed Victoria's fundamental nature. She was what she was, not because of my mistakes, but despite my efforts. I've learned that there are people in this world who are incapable of genuine human connection, who view others merely as resources to be exploited. They can be charming, beautiful, even seemingly loving. But beneath the surface lies only emptiness and endless appetite. The Victoria who played in my garden, who called me mommy with apparent love, who cried when she was hurt. That child was as fabricated as the signatures she forged for $2 million. Every emotion, every moment of seeming vulnerability, every expression of love had been calculated for effect. This knowledge is both devastating and oddly comforting. It means I didn't fail as a mother in the way I initially thought. I was simply unfortunate enough to give birth to someone incapable of the love I offered so freely. On quiet evenings in my new home, watching the sun set over the Atlantic, I sometimes think about the path not taken. What if I had been less controlling? What if I had given Victoria unlimited access to money from an earlier age? What if I had been a different kind of mother? But I know now that these questions are meaningless. Victoria would have taken whatever I gave and demanded more. She would have found fault with any approach I took, because finding fault justified her eventual betrayal. Nothing I could have done differently would have prevented what happened. The worst part wasn't the $2 million. The worst part was discovering that I had spent 3 decades loving someone who was never really there. But perhaps that's also the most important part. Because despite everything, despite the betrayal, the manipulation, the calculated cruelty, I did love. I loved completely, unconditionally, with everything I had to give. That the recipient of that love was incapable of receiving or reciprocating it doesn't diminish the love itself. And that love, I've learned, is something Victoria can never steal. It's the one thing she couldn't forge, couldn't manipulate, couldn't turn to her advantage. It remains mine, pure and intact, a testament to who I am rather than a reflection of who she became. In the end, I survived because I was capable of love and trust and hope, qualities that made me vulnerable to exploitation, but also made me fundamentally human. Victoria may have taken my money and destroyed my family, but she couldn't take my capacity for connection, for growth, for building something meaningful from the wreckage of betrayal. Today I am poorer in dollars, but richer in wisdom. I am smaller in material possessions, but larger in genuine relationships. I am sadder about the past, but more hopeful about the future. And somewhere in France, a woman who used to be my daughter continues her hunt for new victims, empty and calculating, surrounded by luxury but incapable of joy, successful in her schemes, but utterly alone in her victory. Between us, I know who won.